welcome to the audience, welcome to the artists of the MMDD, and welcome to those who are going to join us online, and welcome to the guests of this roundtable conversation, which is part of the Micro and Macro Dramaturgies in Dance project. I'd like to welcome the four guests for this conversation. Sune Bernd, she, her, dramaturg and lecturer. Tina Tarpgård, she, her, choreographer. Naya Moll, she, her, choreographer and dramaturg. And Rasmus Koff, he, him, and dramaturg and auteur. My name is Katalin Trencényi. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a dramaturg and researcher. This conversation is part of the Micro and Macro Dramaturgies in Dance project, which is supported by and funded by the Creative Europe program. It is a European collaboration between 6 contemporary dance organizations, which is Bora Bora, our host today here in Aarhus, Dans Brabant in the Netherlands, Dans has Lemesos in Cyprus, Anghiari Dance Hub and Marca Teatro in Italy, and Tanja Spraha in the Czech Republic. And obviously the people who make this project are the 20 artists who spend altogether 4 residencies with us. This is the second full year of the project, and this is our first residency for the second year of cohort, and it is hosted by Bora Bora. As some of you know, for each residency we have a topic, a theme, and for these 10 days we chose the topic of disturbing patterns. When we thought about this with the organizers, Jesper and Jeppe at Bora Bora, and Alexis Vassiliou, who is the co-curator and facilitator of the residency, we never thought that this topic would bite us back. We thought we would be disturbing patterns, but I think the patterns are already in the world disturbing us, which is in a way a response to what we wanted to explore during this residency, because we can understand this theme, this idea in 2 ways: patterns that disturb us, that we find problematic, that are unattainable, that we want to break up with. Or the other understanding is how we can create disturbances, how we can disjolt the rhythm or patterns in order to create change. And with this, I'm bringing it back to the topic of our conversation for this afternoon, which is about how dramaturgy can be an instigator of change. And why this question, apart from the fact that it's coming from dramaturgs or people who are involved in dramaturgy? It's probably because, first of all, dramaturgy is a political act. You allow a different viewpoint, a different viewpoint into the process and respond to that. And that's an inherently political act. The other reason why we think we could ask or pose this question is because because dramaturgy works with questions. It doesn't work with statements. We work through questions and asking questions and challenging patterns or hierarchies. So without further ado, I would like to pose this question to you and ask you first to introduce yourself and position yourself before answering the question, how can dramaturgy be an instigator of change? Can dramaturgy create a butterfly effect that can bring about the much wanted change we talked about throughout the pandemic, throughout the war, throughout this crisis we are living through. The idea for this afternoon is that during crisis time, we sit with the crisis, we sit with the uncomfortable feeling of difficulties, and use collaborative thinking, use the power of the community coming together and discussing our thoughts and ideas. So after an hour, I'd like to invite you to contribute, not only through questions, but also thoughts, ideas, share with us where you are, and let's continue the thinking together. This public thinking will end at 5:30, where we'll continue the conversation in a more private way. So first of all, Sine, can dramaturgy be an instigator of change?
Yeah.
And how?
Thank you, Katalin, and thank you also, Bora Bora, for this invitation to this panel. I'm glad that you contextualized and framed it by saying change is already happening. So in that sense, how is dramaturgy dealing with change is maybe also an interesting question for the times. Thinking about how to instigate change, dramaturgy is about, as you said, asking questions. And so when I was thinking about how to answer this question, I was thinking, sorry, I should just contextualize that I'm a dramaturg working in dance, also a lecturer. So that's the position I'm speaking from. So I was thinking back to some conversations a couple of years ago about dramaturgy, where dramaturgs were saying, actually, it's no longer enough to think of dramaturgy as just about the work that's happening in the space, the composition of the work. Maybe we need to think about dramaturgy as also the macro structures, the things that are also happening outside of the space. And it led me to think about an essay that Marian van Keekhoven wrote, I think back in 2009, where she also was addressing that it's also something about the dramaturgy of process. There's something about dramaturgy which is about facilitating process. And so this led me to thinking about sustainability, which is a big, I think, question for today. That maybe dramaturgy today is also about asking questions about how we work and the kinds of conditions that we are setting up for the work that we do. How sustainable are those structures? Also in view of, obviously, environment, but also just in view of time and sometimes the lack of time that we have. So this kind of connection to how can dramaturgy affect change is also what kinds of questions are we asking about the way we work and the way we produce work. So maybe this is also a good moment for us to look inwards and to ask those kinds of questions about how we are facilitating those kinds of processes. We do, I think, need to probably start considering this idea of sustainability more also in terms of the environment. How are these questions, the things that are happening outside of the theatre space, also beginning to impact on the work that we make and the way that we might have to work? So this is an interesting moment, having just gone through a kind of pandemic which shifted and changed things for us, to ask how did that affect the way we were thinking about how we work and how we maybe want to work. And that's one of the prompts I took with me also from Van Keekhoven. Maybe it is also the moment to start asking those kinds of questions, looking inwards, asking how we are working, what are the conditions that we are facilitating for the work that we want to make, and how are we also responding to the external pressures that are of various sorts that are happening and affecting the way that we work. So I took this opportunity that you gave us, Katalin, to also think very much about process. How am I, as a dramaturg, facilitating process, and what kinds of processes am I interested in being part of and facilitating. And circling back to Van Keekhoven's idea of macro and micro, how is the macro also affecting the micro? So for me, it was an invitation to look at how we're setting up processes and the conditions that we are creating for the work that we make, and also how we're responding to the conditions around us. Yeah.
Thank you, Sune. This is an invitation for Naya, Rasmus, and Tina to respond briefly to Sune's provocation or thought.
I mean, I think it's very. I can very much relate to the idea of really looking at the macro idea, like how are we existing as artists. This is something that for me, coming from a point of view of being producing and creating artists, that it goes further than how it goes into our lives as such. Is how do we actually live? How do we even sustain ourselves? That's one thing, but also what implication does what we do have on other people? I think I absolutely can relate to this, and I think it has been very it's been a magnifying glass on it during these sort of waves of crises that has been very present over the last years. So,
Thank you. So the ethics of our being and the ethics of our processes as humans, as artists, and as creators. Naya, Rasmus, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm thinking about the micro and the macro, and of course that's probably something you've all been discussing a lot this week, and how we should not let the macro perspective inhibit our micro politics or our micro actions, because that's definitely a possibility that this whole macro perspective can stun us, because it's so big and there's so much responsibility, and but actually all the time having a view on this relation between the micro and the macro, and how they affect each other, how my nervous system is affecting your nervous systems, is affecting the whole situation around us. So I'm just, it's just a thought that we need to keep this relation in perspective all the time between the micro and the macro, and not lose ourselves in either of them, I think.
Oscillate between the micro and the macro. Dramaturgy as a constant movement. This is also a Van Keekhoven thought, and I think probably even the title of one of her essays. Naya, is there anything you'd like to?
No, I agree. I just thought of like it's the micro and the macro is intertwined, and I think it's nice to bring up this of sustainability, and I think it's important that we consider not sustainability to be something we have to do out there somewhere else, but it's for me very much about the politics inside also the working space, or like just inside in relations. So also about like working conditions, and care is a big thing for me, and I think that has also to do with sustainability.
Thank you, Naya. I think I'd like to leave it with you and throw the ball back to you again. So how would you respond to the question? And again, I'd like to ask you just to position yourself before.
So I'm a dancer and choreographer and a dramaturge. And the dramaturge is a fairly new thing that I'm starting to place myself in. And for me, it is closely connected to my choreographical practice. I've tried to think of them as separate, but I don't think I can do that actually. But to just contextualize my way into dramaturgy is that I'm working closely together with a friend and colleague called Emilie Gregersen, who's a choreographer, and I've been a dramaturge in her last 2 pieces. So it's a new thing for me, and I think I also, so I'm the new and a fresh member of the dramaturgical field somehow. Fresh, but I'm it's not something I've studied. It's new, so I maybe also have different references or a lack of references also.
A
But
different
for
perspective.
different. But for me, it has very much to do with relationality, in terms of I've not tried to be a dramaturge for anyone else, so I've not tried to come into a process where I don't know the choreographer, so I can only speak from how I've been working so far, and it's a very close collaboration. And I think for me it's really important that there is a shared, some shared knowledge and common ground somehow, because in that sense you have a better possibility, for me at least, to provide something that could be knowledge that could be valuable for the work or for the choreographer. And for me, it is very much, you also mentioned, it's very much about asking questions and asking questions to the piece and around the piece. And for me, it's very much about looking at the piece and figuring out what is the logic of this piece. What is the pattern or the image or the world, you could say. So not imposing things, but figuring out what is it that this work is doing, what is it that it wants, what is the the mode of existing somehow. And then you sort of take care of that situation and try to challenge it, or try to respond to it, and in different ways try to contextualize it. And I also, it's new for me, Van Kerkhoven's a notion of the micro-macro, but I've actually also been using it a lot, because I feel for me it was very implicit in the work of the dramaturge to oscillate or to intertwine between these different scales somehow, or perspective. Because I think also there is always something that the work does in a space, in time, but it also does something in a larger context. And in that sense, there's always politics at play. And I think it's important to question what is it that is at stake when you are actually presenting something. When you place bodies on stage, there's already politics at play. And then both the choreographer and the dramaturge has the possibility to change how you want to frame something, at least in certain sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. What is at stake for us here in this moment? So I'm just throwing it out. Maybe we'll find a answer to that. Maybe not. What is at stake for us right here, right now, as dramaturgs, as artists, as a community, as human beings? What is at stake? Any responses to Noya's or challenges?
It got me, sorry, it got me thinking about the idea of sparring, which is something you would use in boxing. But so you spar with a partner to be a better boxer, but but you can also use it in relation to pedagogics, or in this sense also as a dramaturge in some ways of the word. And the idea is that you give maximum resistance with minimal damage. So I was just thinking about that idea versus the caring for the, if you could see those two working side by side, I mean sparring and caring, or if they're opposed to each other. That's the question, or just an idea, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm not sure if there are, I mean, caring doesn't have to just be like stroke someone and make them feel nice. For me, care is not about being nice necessarily.
No.
For me, it's more like as for me it's more political than that. It's actually that you want something, and then you also want to create ways to work in different ways where we don't. I mean, artists in like many, like just as a society, but also artists. I mean, people are exhausted, and people they get stressed, and they, people work in the field for a short time, and then they have to do something else because it's too hard. And we know there's a lot of different structures that are making this a really precarious working field, of course. So what are the means where we can create structures within that can take care of each other? So for me, it's actually very much an act somehow, the act of care, and not to be polite or nice. So yeah. So I think you could definitely push something, and I think that's caring for the work also. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more thoughts?
Well, if we think about dramaturgy as change, then what you're also saying is that you pick up on something in a process and make some kind of intervention in terms of care, is what I'm hearing you say. So what kind of change you're prompting by your presence also and by your intervention? I think that's an interesting one. That your presence is also a form of change in some ways.
I think it's also Emilie is performing her works herself, and is the choreographer and the author of it. So I am the one that are witnessing the work. So yeah, so there is always a presence to the work somehow.
Yes,
Yeah.
a witness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tina?
Yeah, I mean, I picked up on this an act of care. I think this is quite a wonderful way of putting it, because there's something about the act of doing, like the action to actually relating also to process, that nothing is somehow disconnected to the idea of the process of, let's say, for example, change, or how we want to create sustainability or sustainable structures for existing as artists. I mean, today being an artist in itself is being an activist almost, right? It's almost an activist act to claim to be an artist. So this sort of act of care and understanding how that actually has a very strong place in the world right now is actually, that's kind of where I would like to spring from. Because my background is I'm an artist, I'm a choreographer, I'm not a dramaturg. I have worked with dramaturgs in my time, but I wanted to actually just look a little bit on, also following on the conversations that are present, the responses that has been already, maybe even look a little bit closer at the word change. Because in some ways, I would actually like to challenge the idea of change, because change in some ways can also become a bit of a, at least if I'm talking from an artist's perspective, like I would like to be part of a change around me. I would like to be part of the sustainable future. I would like to, all of these things that I know that I'm dealing with in my thinking and in my work as an artist, which also then affects the dramaturgy of the things that I'm doing and affects the processes. But I think it would be interesting to just also understand that change can also become almost a little bit something that you impose on others. Like, so which change? For who change? And how change? So one of the keystones that I would like to look at is the sense of how we can move from the idea of change into the to really creating this longitude process of relation as something that is the center of it. I don't know if you can follow me in this, but I'll try to elaborate on it. Inside change, I feel like there is a notion of hope somehow, a hope of a better place. And I I would like to quote Deborah Hay for saying, I don't work with hope, I work with trust. I work with doing, I work with actually being and in the process. And also the idea that what is at stake is the fact that your processes has an impact on the, not just the environment close to you, but also to what is actually, what is the agency that will arise in the communities around you. In that way, I think that the act of care and the act of sustainability becomes the core points of trying to imagine that to being an artist, we can imagine it as a way of being culture creating. In some ways, there's almost a claim of change inside it. But what if we, rather than talk about change, talking about sustained relations inside communities, sustained relations across sectors, sustained relations towards different audiences or different collaborators and stuff, and other possibilities. For me, that at least opens up the possibility of creating spaces where you invite for the conversation. Now I'm not only talking within the artist community, but also with your audiences, with members of communities in which we exist as artists. And maybe there is at least a way of informing that the change is not something of my desire to change the world or to make a better place, but to create an informed space in which we together as humans can evolve or go further or go into a place that hopefully will be more sustainable and a better space for people to be in. Being in communities for artists to live more sustainable with each other or have sustainable structures to be in, or talking about our crises that we are surrounded with, because we've been faced with them, we've been asked to deal with them. And somebody in the workshop just, I actually think it was you, Naya, said like, the artist is some way always the person who is expected to be the first ones to be agile, change. Almost you said is the wet dream of the neoliberal structures, because it's always there to be changing. But I think that we sometimes can get a little bit somewhat almost overwhelmed by the idea that change is good and change is the next level, change is to the better. Maybe it's good for us to think more into sustained relations and somewhat agency through that. So that, yeah, I believe that we need to be careful with our desire for change somehow, and rather put ourselves in the position of the relational and the listener in our way of approaching the world as artists, and in our dramaturgies, and in our way of creating our processes.
Excellent, beautiful. I think there's a lot to respond to,
Yeah.
so who would like to go first?
I want to rephrase something that I said in the beginning because I was nervous. I said that I'm a fresh dramaturg or something with freshness, and I want to rephrase that. I just meant that I'm new in the field. I just felt it came out like dumb smart or something like fresh. And it really felt like rephrasing that, so it was not to be pretentious or anything. I think it's really important what like this that you're touching on here in the end, because I also said a little bit with this how can the dramaturg be the instigator of change, and this like of the kind of need for newness and change all the time, and sometimes this that the artist has to respond to the social environment, or somehow that for me it sometimes can sound like it's like there is a program coded into like art has to be political, and for me art doesn't have to be political, but it's always there's always politics at play. So for me it's inherently political, but for me it's not now something is happening, we need to respond by making dance pieces about that. yeah, somehow this of like change versus like sustaining something over time, because we change all the time and it's exhausting. So why change?
Yeah. There are two thoughts I'd like to contribute to or build on to Tina's. One is on hope. I just felt like that when talking about hope, I think Rebecca Solnit's name also needs to be mentioned, who says hope is an action. So there's a quote, I'm going to quote it freely, but she says, hope is not a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa with. Hope is an axe that you use to break a door during emergency. And I like that we said the word action several times, because that I can weave it back to dramaturgy as weaving together actions, weaving together hope, weaving together sustainability. And with that, I would also like to refer to another thought of yours, Tina, when you mentioned that sustained relationships is what we should think about. So let's change thinking about change. And what if it's sustained relationships? And that takes me to the dramaturgs or a very dramaturgical role of creating context. And so I'm just putting it out here to think about this collaboratively, or think about dramaturgy from this point of view.
Yeah, I have two things with the, because now you mentioned hope again, and I'm trying to figure out who this quote is from, but the quote is something like, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And I've always struggled with that quote, because I really want to make despair convincing. It's much more fun, but I think it's also true that to make hope possible is really, I mean, that's big. And it's a guy called something Williams, I think, an anarchist from Wales or something like that. Somebody look it up. So there was just, it sprung out of the talk about hope. And then I was thinking about the sustained relationships and change, and how change could be, you could exchange that word with growth, and kind of be caught in that same kind of cycle of going for the next. And that, I think that's important, but it also points back at the processes that Sune was talking about, and how parts of this arts world is so project based, and all the time the next project and the project in itself should work in some way that instigates change, or in some way creates meaning from itself, and not in an, I mean, so there's a huge change in the way we see the way we work to be made, if we should really go with that idea of sustained relations. And I think also it plays into the micro-macro, because in some senses we need to go to the micro relationships. And I think for me that's, I want to do the macro change. I feel it's, I mean, all the small, talking with a neighbor, it feels too small. I want to change the world. So how to do that without talking with your neighbor?
Yes.
Probably it's not possible.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah. Absolutely. Any more?
I think it's what you're bringing or introducing is also this notion of dramaturgical practice as something that stops the process and says, just wait a minute. Sometimes there's this notion that dramaturgy is about making things smooth. So it's about making an effective, strong structure, something that works. And what you're saying is, well, maybe dramaturgical practice is also what you're saying, Rasmus, is something that stops it and says, let's complicate this a little bit by asking that question, rather than making this a kind of effective piece of work. So this notion really, again, of questioning and stopping something, slowing something down in order to not make it more understandable, but maybe make it more complicated. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or complex. So I think that's nice, that sort of slow, let's just wait a minute, let's just see what's going on here, let's slow down the process, let's complicate it rather than smooth over the cracks. It's something that I sort of just thought when you were talking. It's like, that's something.
Or bring awareness to it.
Yeah.
Rasmus, it's time to pose the same question to you. 40 minutes ago, I voiced in this room. So if you again could position yourself first, and then bring us your challenge.
Yeah. So I'm Rasmus, and I'm artistic co-director of a small company that's based here in Aarhus. We call Theater Flux, and we do kind of variation of site-specific work, theater for young audiences, sound installations, sound walks, a lot of different works, all based on resonance and led by research and with a view to what would that be? Relevance. So we keep the R's. Relevance. And I've thought about this question from a few different angles. Dramaturgy as an instigator of change. And we've touched upon some of them already, and I think that one of the very key things for the dramaturge, or for the working with dramaturgy, is context awareness. You talked about creating context. We've touched upon context in different ways. I very much like to put it out on the, to have this awareness of the context that we're working within, and then we can go with it, or we can go against it, or we can find disturbances to put into it, but we need to be aware of the context, and not just the subject, but also the subject and the persons that told us about the subject, and the whole political issue around the subject. So there's a huge research work to be done around context. It's not just looking around seeing who's there, but also who's outside the building, who's all the way, this whole holistic view of context in that sense. And then I got a little nervous this morning, and I started thinking, but what is dramaturgy? I mean, it's also about how we stage things. It's about the context. It's so big. So I thought, okay, I'll just think about one example of how I've worked with dramaturgy that could create some kind of change. And this example is from a piece we did about dementia, and we did a lot of research into the field of dementia. And one of the pieces of research that I found was these scans of brains from Alzheimer patients, and they talk about how in the scans of these brains you can see clutters, you can see what would almost look like cloud structures in the brain. And from there I took a thread of that and put into the Norse mythology and said, okay, there's these Norns, which are the goddesses of fate, which are actually from Roman or Greek mythology, but they took them into the Norse mythology as well. So the scene that was built on that was built on this connection between the brain scans, the goddesses of fate, and then interacting with the audience, giving them threads around the arm and talking with them about how they see their fate and how they think that their days will end, and if they would actually like to know or not. And my hope is that the context was clear enough and trustworthy enough that the audience actually allowed themselves to be shaken a little bit, to actually start thinking about how would my end of days be, what is dementia for me, would I actually prefer to know or not how I end my days. So we come back to the issue of trust as well. Building trust is, I think, building enough trust that you can shake people is for me a key, not just for a dramaturge, but for any artistic endeavor that I go into anyway, as an author, as a performer, as a dramaturge. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Any immediate comments or thoughts or contributions to Rasmus's?
I think the image of trust there is really. I was just sitting and thinking about the sense of the space in which we can create trust. Also has to do with the sense of a certain amount of time spent. And I guess that certain amount of time spent is also somehow staying with things. I know I just heard a bit about like that, doesn't it? Like spending time inside these processes in the processes of the dramaturgical space, and enough time so that trust can build. I've always felt that trust was such a time consuming thing. And I think it's somewhat something we should be cherishing and understanding. It's important for us as artists in our work and our lives and in the way we work. So I love the word trust in terms like, so I took Deborah Hayes, it's not hope, it's about trust. And being and staying with the trouble if somebody wants to drag in Donna Haraway as well.
So basically, I hear, or what I hear coming from this conversation, we are talking about agency. We are talking about whether out of frustration or whether or not, I don't know. But I can't not zoom this conversation out from our micro, safe rehearsal spaces where we work with other artists, slow down time, think about processes, think about sustainability, think about a bit of mischief. But that safe space has been shaken, or maybe it has never been safe. But what is the agency of dramaturgical thinking in this situation? And maybe this might be a good time to open it up to collaborative thinking. What is our agency? How can we create that sustainability? What can we do as artists, dramaturgs, here and now? What are your thoughts? What are your questions? Where are we with that today?
When you say this situation, which situation are you referring to?
This whole big mess we are sitting in the middle. I feel that I can't cut the ties from the time we are living. Even with our shoes, we don't leave the world outside in the dance of the dance studio. And for instance, as Rasmus mentioned, that I might want to condemn aggressors, but if I'm not greeting my neighbor, maybe there's an aggression on a different level that I might need to think about. So how can dramaturgy or dramaturgical thinking be an agent in societal change? Or can dramaturgy or dramaturgical or or maybe let's rephrase it without the word change. Okay, how would we rephrase that question, removing the change? That's my first question.
That's a big one.
No, go on.
I just wanted to say that I think, of course, it can. I don't know if it can change, but it is a very appropriate response to a time where there are big changes, imposed changes, in massive amounts. I mean, we have a long one like that we live with, like the climate crisis. There was a pandemic that is very different to any lived time I've had in my lived life, at least. And I've obviously been a very privileged person in a very peaceful place, so in that way I can say from my privileged point of view that has been very dramatic. For other people it was probably much less dramatic because their lives were different. And then of course there's now something about a proximity, about the danger of war that we now in Europe feel. Many things come to my head and I think dramaturgical thinking and artistic practice is a very appropriate response, especially if that is a response that brings people into places of talking and actually exchanging and spending time. Because I think if anything is needed, it is the interconnectivity, the continuous shared of knowledge within what we do. I think it's a massively appropriate response. And I think we should be proud to stand by it, and I think we should make sure that it's visible as an alternative. So I would say it's very important. I don't know if I rephrase the word change, but I think change is something that's been imposed on us. And I do want to say, when I say what I just did, that it is also something that is very much from a European privileged position, that this is now a specifically critical time. Just to make sure that everybody understands that I understand that, because it looks different from other places. And then we can talk a lot about how we deal with the idea of refugees as different kind of refugees, apparently. This is another big question in which I think that our way of trying to be critical towards what's happening is also appropriate. And now I'm referring to the fact that we treat refugees very differently according to what the crisis they're fleeing from, apparently. And that's just, for me in a way, it's shocking. So I'm like, I want to talk about this. I wanna discuss this as well. So, yeah, I can only say, I don't know if it's about change, it's about response. And I think our practice is incredibly important and appropriate.
I think also you're specifically talking about dramaturgical thinking or dramaturgical practice. I think a part of that is always about looking at what is at stake here. And I guess that is also what one can do, is something is happening, something is going on, what is going on, and what is at stake, and how is this changing the way we can't talk about we in the sort of monolith sense, as in we're all the same, but how does this change things? How does it change the stakes also? And I think you're absolutely right. We have actually just been through and are going through a phase where things are change is imposed on us, and that's kind of, so how are we dealing with that? How are we responding to this? And that's why for me I wanted to start with this notion of maybe it prompts us to rethink certain things. It also maybe makes us think about who's included here and who's excluded. And by this I also mean who is making the work and for whom. So for me there's also something about, it's not just about audiences in terms of inclusion, but it's also people that have access to means of production and the institutions and the spaces. So it's all of that, I think, that is part of looking at what is at stake. And also, I think we are going to have to address how is the kind of environmental crisis also changing means of production and where we are producing and how we're producing. And this is going to be something I think that will shape dramaturgies in the future. I worked on a piece for Tanz im August this summer, a dance piece where we were outside because of the pandemic, but it made me think about what does it mean to create dramaturgy from what's at hand, what you have, not what you necessarily create or produce. Making a piece with audiences on a football pitch in Kreuzberg, using the lights that are there in the stadium, using the weather, using the daylight or the evening light. And so all of these kind of components that suddenly also brought into it, and this is nothing new. Of course, we've been working outside in outdoor spaces for like ever. But there's something about when a crisis changes the way you have to work, something new occurs or arises, and it's taking stock of what happens in that process. What kinds of dramaturgies are rising out of that. And that's also sort of a little bit privileged to some extent, because that's from a kind of very safe position of making a piece. But I think that is what we can do. We can address how those processes have to change, also who our audiences become, and what kinds of dramaturgies we're producing as a consequence also of change. And in that, maybe change is also being produced in us. And I think that's the thing. We're talking about activating change, but we are also changing with those changes. And that, I think, is something maybe also to think about, taking stock of how did this change us, and how are these changing production conditions changing us.
I think that's a really important shift of perspective, that what do we need to change, and what needs to change in us, in our processes, why do we want the rest of the world to be different? What are the changes that have to come from us? And that's even closer to home than the neighbor. It's starting with a shifting the question.
I'm thinking again about the the micro and the macro and responsibility, and how there's like a macro responsibility or a structural responsibility to make sure to make some changes, to include, to do all of these things that I think most people agree with. And then at the micro level, also make sure that it is not a change that is imposed on us, but actually something that we do if we want to do that as artists or as dramaturgists. So this balance between not only being funded if you work with something climate related or crisis related, but you can also actually work with love, and it doesn't have to be about gender, or I mean, just to have this kind of balance between that individual artists are not the ones that has to take this responsibility, but it has to be taken on a structural level, on a macro level, which is not the same as to say that we shouldn't take it, but we shouldn't feel obliged to take that responsibility as individuals, I think. And that's a thin line, but I was just been thinking a lot about that and how we navigate through that.
I had one thought. We just talked a lot about the day of patterns and changing patterns, and at least from my perspective, just thinking about, I mean, just take an issue as gender. Like if you look at, it's also about what society proposes, right? Because I think that with whatever comes from a crisis, like for example a war, I think that it's good to maybe notice a little bit what happens to how we talk about gender in those situations, because it is actually really important, I think, to be able to create responses through our practices that because I actually find it as an urgency to be an artist and to not to take the full responsibility, but maybe to just be aware of the importance of that thinking to exist, maybe especially when we get challenged. I don't know. I mean, artists are fleeing from Russia. We have lots of, there's so many things that are very much for some people it's extremely real, and their families are inside this, and the danger is at their front door. We're not there yet at the moment, like in terms of what Europe is living through right now. But I think it's very important that we in time are very aware of our what it is that our practices, dramaturgical thinkers, and our relationship to society around, what importance it have. I think we can help each other, not on an individual level, but meet, share, discuss, like we're doing now, like talk about it, like what is our role, what is how are we doing about trying to create sustained relations between each other and to the world around us, and insist that this practice is can be quickly threatened, I suppose, is what I'm saying, and I think very important.
That comes back to contextual awareness, or awareness of context again also.
Also thinking a little bit, and I'm saying this not in all to relativize what is worse and what is what, but there's also something a little bit about this urgency there is suddenly now for this crisis that we have to then there has been so many wars, so many crises, and there is a little bit of like, so now it is, of course it's closer, you can say in one sense, but I'm not really buying that argument also. I think there's a lot of structural racism in place also in that.
Lots.
And I'm not, hope I understand that I'm saying this not to say that there is a hierarchy in what is worse or anything.
Can I just quickly respond?
Of course.
Because I think I completely agree that there is a big element. I think I also tried to talk about it before. There's apparently a difference, like we're talking from, there's a different way of looking at issues such as like refugees, for example. It's clearly very different in how it's being managed or dealt with. But I think it's not only racism. I agree that there is certainly elements of that, but there is also a proximity thing at play, and also a direct, maybe more now than maybe ever before, attack on something that I think we do have to recognize, that there are some values that we share in a sort of European context. And I think we are feeling attacked on that. I think as such. I mean, at least I feel attacked on it. I do, actually. In a different way than before. So I agree with you, but I think there's not only that at play. I think there's also something else.
Yeah, for sure. I think I get also a little bit quiet because now we are on micro levels that I don't have knowledge enough about large politics. I know thing about dance and choreography, and a little bit about dramaturgy. So like also somehow we can macro, and then at some point I'm losing my somehow if I have anything to contribute with, because it's also in terms of this war, there's like I don't understand, like things, a lot of things I don't understand. So when we start to talk on this micro, like not micro, macro political level, I also I get challenged in my lack of knowledge also. So that's also why I quiet a bit.
But if when we talk about change in macro level, isn't it that when we say change, we mean we want some back to normal, something that is normal to us. So something is disturbing us, and we want that disturbance to go away, and we want a different arrangement that is familiar to us, that is familiar to our norms, that is familiar to our belief systems, that is familiar from our perspective. This is a question.
Probably.
I mean,
Probably in the deep psychological urge to have peace and quiet and normal thinking, I think maybe yes. But I think also it's important to look at the possibilities, that every crisis is also always a possibility to change something in new directions and to move forward. And for instance, this talk about refugees, and there has been a lot of different positions in the Danish debate on this, and some of the constructive or hopeful positions are saying, okay, now we are letting a lot of people stay here for a while. Could we make that the way we treat refugees in the future? Could that be like, could we learn from that? Could that be the way Europe is from now on treating refugees and this crisis? And of course there's a lot of let's say distrust in that, but there's still there are different ways of different perspectives on a situation that is not necessarily, oh, let's just go back to what we know, but maybe also let's find ways to move forward.
With this, I'd like to bring it back to micro practices and ask a question from you and from the audience participants. If you can think of any examples in your practice when you managed to create that sustained relationship, when you managed to create that change in micro level, that you felt that it had reverberations. So concrete project, a concrete work, where you felt it was realized.
Sorry, what was realized? The change, a change was happening, and okay.
I think for me the issue with that question, or the reluctance I have with that, is that it's so. I have a number of examples where one person after a performance can come up and say, "Oh, this made me think about this," or "I've never thought about this way," or. But it's so subjective, and it's so hard to know. I'm getting more curious about the larger structures of that than. Sometimes it's easy to just say, "Oh, this 4 months process, and I don't know how much money this cost, made a difference for this one person in this school at that time." So
I'm not talking about that, because I think that's the idea of every performance that we want to create, that those who participate, attend, are part of it, they live differently than before. I'm talking about those serendipitous moments when sometimes you feel that it was more than that. It echoed beyond your attention.
I think what I can think of just right now is I've been involved in a couple of pieces that have worked with non-professional performers, so young performers or people with no prior experience to taking part in a performance process. And that, for me, has been, that's maybe as close I can, just thinking now, because that, it changes something for them, or at least in the conversations I then have with them, what it's doing for them to partake in a process like that, and what it's like for them to meet an audience for the first time in that kind of context. And it's a very different kind of conversation you have with people who have no prior experience to being involved in a process like that. And then also coming back to them later and talking to them about that experience. And so I think in terms of change, that's when you sense that actually being involved in what we just did really made a difference to them in one way or another, in ways that are very different to, say, a professional performer who moves on to the next project or then moves on to the next project. So it's also a change that stays with them in a different way. This is maybe a really banal example, actually, but that's what I could think of, because it's made an impression on me also, those conversations.
Yeah.
That had nothing to do with politics, but yeah.
I find it a little difficult to answer, because I feel like I don't know if I'm capable of seeing it at least in someone else, but I can say when something has changed in me, like a moment that changed my practice, and actually, I mean, there's several of them. I don't think there's like sort of like the one epic one that sort of like tilted, but there are several changes all the time, and they are very important, very extremely. I treasure them a lot. And the latest one that I experienced was the meeting with a lot of communities that gather around dancing in Skåne. It was a project, we were doing something, but we started with the process of visiting different communities just to understand, ask very simple questions. Why do you dance? What made you come here? Look, what is it that inspired you to go there and do this like physical exercise together? And the amount of passion and the amount of sense of community that I was faced with, and the richness of that really made an impact on me, and I think will change many. Like it just, I don't know how, but I can feel that it was profoundly something that changed something in me. So I mean, if that could be an answer to it, because I think I feel the change in me. I don't really know if I can really say the change in others, but
very much so. So, unless you wanted to respond, yes.
I could respond, but I would respond maybe not. I would maybe respond in another way, but
Yes.
in some way, not answering your question, but bringing attention to something that I think can provide change, is also something that has to do with identification in some sense. That something that I think is really, I appreciate, is being challenged these years and will be more, I hope, is representation on stage, because as soon as bodies are on stage, there is politics at play, and this of allowing other bodies to be visible, and for audiences to identify in different ways, whether it is how like body type or ethnicity or gender or all these factors. So like the intersectional view that is, it's slowly maybe more from what's it called, from below, but it's hopefully it's gonna, because that's so important to be seen, and that can provide change, I think.
If we imagine,
I think somebody may be up here.
yes,
Hello, I'm Ivona from Prague, and I'm hearing you, and sometimes I'm a little bit concerned about, do we really understand what is the crisis of these days? Because you spoke about danger of war. Sorry, it's not danger of war. It's a reality we are living in. There are people in Ukraine which are under attack of aggressive Russia. They are leaving their homes, they are leaving their families, and they come to our countries. And if we speak about the reality in these days, it's about how can every one of us help these people. Not only thinking about, okay, how can we maybe later take care about refugees, but we have to do it. And are we really ready to come out of our comfort? And then to think really differently about how we will deal and what is the power of art in this moment. Because the power of art is incredibly strong. And we can really help a lot because art has a power to help to go out of trauma, has a power to help to the refugees to forget for a moment what they are surviving and to really go ahead to be, we are speaking about sustainability, inclusion, well-being, but we have to come back. What is inclusion? And how much we can really do for not only usual people, but also for artists from Ukraine. And here I can see that every one of us can do something. And there is the power, if every individual is doing it, then it makes sense because it's very helpful for the whole situation in this moment. So I would just really, in this very, very macro context, just would like to tell that we have to think differently and we are not coming back to normal. The world is changing and it will be never as it was before COVID. And it will be never as it was before the war, because we are now in the moment of the biggest conflict in Europe after the Second World War. And we should really think about it.
It feels like that we've been here before and we haven't learned to sing. Perhaps because Peter is sitting in the audience, I just thought of Brecht and him rethinking theatre and theatre's role as a response to the war, putting down those tools, putting down those aesthetics that under these new circumstances didn't serve us, and assign a much more political role to theatre, acknowledging that it's a somewhat limited role, but given the times, our responsibility is to respond to the crisis. What do we have to say? Or so it's two questions. Did we learn nothing in our privileged position in Europe? That it has to be a war in Europe that reminds us of this? And what is the role of dance, choreography, dance dramaturgy in this situation?
I mean, I think that there is, I mean, where there is certainly a number of people who go out and actively just do and help, like on a very, very much on a response level. And that, of course, is a response that anyone can, like, that I think anyone should do. And I think that there are many artists that are doing that, for example, around. But I also think that we have a responsibility to connect with one another, like to as like beyond the response to help. I think we still have a strong responsibility to contain, like to talk and deal with the ethics, the value that we are dealing with, to be present with each other and with the communities that we are in. I don't really think that those things are necessarily two different things. I think that they are two different levels, maybe. So I'm not sure if I could hear everything you said. I'm sorry if I didn't. It was not so loud, but I think that the response of action is, of course, one of the very key stones in many actions. And it's difficult to contemplate the consequences of the current crisis, obviously. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine. And I think that, I don't know how to, I mean, I'm a person who also experienced the ending of a Cold War and the time in between, and seemingly to not be back there, but to anyway, at least to a danger that is something that was something we felt was not somehow. Are we really back there? Of course, it's super shocking. I don't know if that's a response to it, but I do think that there is different levels of response that is our responsibility. But I think as human beings, we have a responsibility as of in general to respond to it.
I'm thinking about that word, and thank you for calling us back to reality, or calling us out in reality, or whatever, from the bubble we're in here. But I'm thinking about this word responsibility, like the ability to respond, and how we sometimes get caught up in different structural or psychological, often things that stun us, and and it also feeds back into this idea of well, the neoliberal way of acting, or the change all the time, change, and how we feel like, no, I can't stop what I'm doing to help these people now, because I need to do this, because if I don't do this work, I won't get the money, and then in half a year I'll be out of this space, and so we're caught up in all these things that goes around in our heads, and I'll take it back to myself. I'm caught in that, and that's one of the reasons for me not doing much actively, but sending a few monies to help organizations and so on. Because I fear I go into this psychological space where I'm a bit stunned, and I feel that if I start straying away from the path of producing, creating, fundraising, these things that I normally do, that I should do, then all of a sudden I'll be out of work, or I'll be out of whatever, and it's impressive how quickly, at least my mind, and I think a lot of other people's mind, go back to that, from being shaken, seeing, whoa, there's a war, what can we do? And then, few days, few weeks, we're back at this kind of self-preserving. I'm back. Sorry, I'll keep it here. I'm back at that. And then I need these wake-up calls, like the one you just delivered. So thank you for that.
I'd like to ask you to imagine that between us, there isn't a gap, but there's a box. And this is it's a toolbox with old tools and new tools and rusty tools, and some tools that they were borrowed, but they left there, metaphorically speaking. All our dramaturgical tools that we use when creating a work. And I like to invite all of us in this room, what would be those tools that you would have in that box that you want to use in the future to create work? So I'd like to invite all of us to say one contribution, and then we can go as long as we run out of words and ideas. What would be those tools that we would like to have in our common dramaturgical toolbox. I'm stealing your word, Rasmus.
Yeah.
Responsibility. So I'm putting responsibility there. And responsibility and responsibility.
Then I place care there as an act.
The ability to adapt.
I'm going to put in the word of relational in there, because it has been sort of a key sort of sense.
I'm going to put dialogue next to it.
Yeah.
Empathy.
Empathy.
I
It's a
would like to
microphone.
put empathy.
It's there now.
And I would like to put uncompromising.
I don't know what it's called, but these like thongs that you keep the wound open until you have done the surgery. So.
I can put resilience.
And I'll put there an X to break our comfort.
I would like to put sense of urgency.
I would like to put inner eye, and I would like to do something now that I would never do in this occasion, to break my own comfort, which is I will, if it's possible, I would try to respond to what you said, which is, whoa, I'm really putting myself in a bad position now. Like we said, every work, every process of dramaturgy is somehow political. And I am the first to hold that flag. Also because, and I'm going to be really honest, otherwise I would feel what I'm doing is unuseful. Like I have to say in general, or I will feel the pressure that what I do has to be immediately resolving something. So when something like what is happening happens, and it doesn't touch me directly, or not super directly, I always feel like we all say like things are never going to be back to normal, and it happened several times now, and actually I don't know anymore what normal is. Like if I maybe have to accept, and for me for now it's easy, but the things are never normal in a way, and we are kind of we have to react to what happens in a way. And if I was a leaf, then I would just go with the wind. And now it's, we have to take care about this thing with our work. And actually maybe my work doesn't speak about it. So my little answer, which is not really a long-term answer, but would be to try to find in my work something that speaks to that. And to really see if there's something in my work that maybe speaks about other topics, if there is something that can relate to what is happening around me, and maybe to tune myself a little bit there, and maybe awareness would be another word I would put inside of that. Oh my God, thank you.
Thank you. Awareness is in the box. Anything else that we'd like to place in our dramaturgical toolbox?
I think we need to put context in there, but I'm not sure in which sense, because we have the awareness of context, we have the creation of context, we have the adapting context or disturbing context. So I think context in a number of different ways is in the box.
I would also put transparency.
And I would put in a handbag or carrier bag, in the sense that how Ray describes of this entanglement and carrying the stuff around, so not just the axe, and precisely not the axe, therefore maybe.
I'd like to put challenge in the box. We have too many smooth tools in that box. Need something to disturb. Is there anything else we'd like to include in the box?
Yeah, next to the challenge, I would like to add the notion of radicality and the importance to be radical.
And I'll actually explain the X that is connected with what was said about the hope, an X that opened the door with during the emergency. This is what I really am taking today as a very important sentence.
Maybe I will also add questioning.
And situatedness. I like to always think of our own context. And genealogy, I think, is a word I want to put out there, so that we think in terms of longer processes, that what we are doing today is part of something that started in the past and it will go forward. So maybe it's good to situate ourselves a bit in that manner.
I'd like to include time and more time.
And a little bit of trust as well.
And a pinch of playfulness. Feels like no magic potion we are cooking, a recipe. The Anarchist Dramaturgs cookbook.
I would buy it or steal it.
Anything else that we want to put in there? In that case, I'm gonna keep the lid open. And I'd like to invite us to think about new tools that we'd like to include, old tools that we forgot about and would like to bring in there. I'd like to invite those of you who are watching us online to put those tools you would like to include in the box in the comments on social media. You can follow us on the Facebook of Micro and Macro Dramaturgies or on Instagram. So please do include your comments and thoughts and ideas on which tools you would like to include in our ever-changing, ever-growing dramaturgical toolbox. I would like to thank you for your contribution. Great and very grateful to our friends and colleagues for accepting the invitation and have this conversation. Thank you, Tina, Sine, Naya, and Rasmus. I would also like to thank Bora Bora, Jeppe, Jesper, and Kasper for organizing this opportunity for us to talk. I also want to say thank you to Isa and Karsten for creating the technical facilities, and Alexis to help with the microphone. I would also like to thank to those who were watching us online. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would also invite those lucky ones who are sharing the same physical space with us to continue this without microphones in a more relaxed environment. And let's think about how we can instigate sustained relationships for us and for each of us and all of us in the future. Thank you very much for the conversation. Let's begin the conversation. Thank you.